The Marvel Cinematic Universe was an unstoppable beast. The original wave of movies began in 2008 with Iron Man and culminated in 2019 with Endgame. After 31 films, the franchise boasts earnings over $28.6 billion in the global box office alone. But since Phase 4 kicked off in 2021, it feels like there's less and less interest being generated by the properties. Why is that? And is this the signal that we're ready to move on from the superhero genre? When Iron Man was released in 2008, the general public had no idea what they were in for the next decade plus. There was no talk of phases or this thing called the MCU. All anyone knew was that Robert Downey Jr. was perfect as Iron Man, and the cutting-edge CGI at the time was mind-blowing. But then the Edward Norton Hulk happened, and, well, most people have forgotten that movie was part of the plan, and they forgot it for obvious reasons. It landed with a mediocre response from both the public and critics alike. Marvel sought to recover with Iron Man 2 and did so, though while that movie made a boatload of money, critics all agreed it wasn't the best possible follow-up. Then in 2011, Thor and the first Captain America movie dropped, and well, the world was hooked. And of course, Phase 1 came to an end with all these characters being mixed up for the Avengers. Edward Norton being the exception, as his broody version of the Hulk was set aside for a more slapstick version by Mark Ruffalo.
Puny God.
And this was the point that Marvel began printing their own money. And with that, in July of 2012, Kevin Feige announced Phase 2 at San Diego Comic-Con. And that train didn't stop until 2019's Endgame. Phase 4 was announced in the middle of that year, and Phase 5 and 6 was announced in 2022. But it looks like the whole thing is slowing down while whipping through phases much faster, almost as if they're trying to grab as much cash as possible before things fall apart. So, how did we get to this point? Now, you may have noticed I really only focused on Marvel there, and that's for good reason. DC did try to roll out their own universe called the DCEU starting in 2013. But by this time, it kind of just looked reactionary. The movies struggled critically and financially and tried to go the darker route instead of the lighthearted nature of the MCU. And while in that reactionary role to Marvel, the lack of planning did seem to shine through. Marvel had been planning their movies since the mid-aughts and were already done with their first big Avengers movie before DC was able to counter with the Superman movie. Though it's generally seen as an all-around failure with a few bright spots, the DCEU had more to do with the whole genre coming to an end than a lot of people believe. And well, perhaps we can all blame Batman for that. Now, the superhero genre is probably the biggest offender when it comes to reboots, and for the longest time, it really didn't matter. The Batman movies became iconic on the backs of several actors, and it was almost expected after a certain point. And it does actually kind of make sense. The actors age, but the characters they're playing don't. And while this is mostly looking at the DCEU as a potential problem, even Marvel has recast. As we mentioned, Hulk was switched out right at the beginning, and even Terrence Howard was replaced by Don Cheadle between Iron Man movies. And let's not get started on all the Spider-Man reboots. But DC's reboots were a bit more high profile. Now, for starters, while Batfleck ended up having a rather decent run, he was still the Batman that hit the stage after Christian Bale.
I'm Batman.
Now, those shoes were too big to fill for most people, and that was a reboot destined to fail. And the worst part is everyone knew he wanted out. He slowly stepped away from his numerous roles in the creation of those movies. And then, while critics were starting to attack the genre as a whole, DC straight up rebooted a movie only a few years after it was released. Now sure, the original Suicide Squad didn't perform well from a critical perspective, and while the follow-up isn't considered a reboot by the studios, I mean, come on, it's literally a reboot, right? And that was almost a flag of failure to a lot of moviegoers and critics alike, that just seemed to oversaturate the genre with, well, more of the same. But while all this was annoying for fans and did play its part, there are other factors at play in the downfall of the superhero genre. And for this, we're going to have to shift back to Marvel, as they played the biggest part in this. Once Phase 2 was announced, there was a bit of an issue popping up. You see, after the Avengers, none of the movies were true standalones, and each had backstory from previous movies. Even the new TV show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. contributed canon to the series, and honestly, the movies became almost episodic. They began popping up with Easter eggs or inside jokes between movies. And with the exception of Guardians of the Galaxy in 2014, you really needed to go back and watch from the start if you wanted to enjoy the whole series, which meant by the end of 2015, there were 12 movies to watch. You had a lot of work to do if you wanted to catch up. And Phase 3 just muddied the waters even more as the storylines were all converging in every single movie. By the time Endgame came around, everything was completely entwined. In general, there was so much content to wade through and not enough standalone that a lot of people just couldn't watch casually. And while the series finished quite well and was very lucrative, it has been a hard sell for people to begin the whole process anew, especially as the content was being split between platforms and Phase 4 was starting out as a series of TV shows. Now, this was almost perfect timing as COVID was keeping people inside and with plenty of time to binge some shows. But with the pandemic rolling on, it did also help cool things off for future franchises. I don't think we need a history lesson here. We all know what happened. But 2020 was supposed to be a big pivot year for Marvel, with several properties planned to keep the ball rolling and to slowly move people over to the new class of heroes. Some stories were finishing off, like the Black Widow movie, and some offered ways to continue, like Loki. But after delays due to COVID, the world was without anything major from Marvel for almost 2 years. Not to mention the extremes that the world had been through over the pandemic, some people's tastes were changing. Much like how the state of the world dictates musical tastes, does so with movies as well. And much like we have seen in the past, it looks like we might be swinging into a new phase of movie interest. Which means that despite all the missteps of the genre, it might not even come down to a fault that led to the end of this era, but just the simple fact that tastes are changing. This is something we've seen since the dawn of movies themselves. Musicals in the 30s and 40s, westerns in the 50s, and even recently we have seen this as we went from vampires in the 90s to everything being zombies in the 2000s. Could this just be the next evolution in what's popular? Probably. You see, the audience is always changing, and the people that are going to watch movies will dictate what's popular. Your parents will have less pull in what's popular than what you have, and again, that will change as each generation comes of age and pushes their own agenda. And that isn't just with the movie watching level either. Producers that were merely kids when the first Iron Man movie came out are already working towards the next big thing. And while Marvel and Disney are still trying to wring out every last dollar from their amazing franchise, the world's already started to move on. And the very thing that was criticized by Martin Scorsese in 2019 seems to be coming to pass, as the audience seems to be moving back to storytelling. So then, what is the next big thing? I would say it's a little too early to tell what the next big one is, but there are some pretty big indicators. A lot of people believe video game adaptations are the next wave, even though they've struggled to find a foothold throughout the years. Though if they are the next era of big money movies, it will be due mostly to the return of storytelling. Big and ambitious movies with a ton of CGI have mostly failed when trying to recreate games, and with more heartfelt and personal storylines like with The Last of Us picking up steam, well, it's hard not to see it coming. And we all know that Hollywood loves to regurgitate content. Well, this might be their big moment. But as we're talking about the state of the world, well, who knows where this might take us? With films like the Knives Out franchise taking big chunks of wallets, perhaps we're moving towards more detective movies. Or perhaps with the Dahmer Show and other true crime-related booms, maybe that's the next one. Whatever it is, though, it seems that the great storytellers will be more sought out than the big Hollywood directors. Time for some bonus facts. Number one, while it became commonplace for Marvel to set daily records, there was one thing that I didn't expect. At the time of its release, Captain America: The First Avenger became the third highest grossing motion picture set during the World War II era, after Saving Private Ryan and Pearl Harbor. Number two, you remember that to-do list that Captain America had, his way of catching up with time? Well, it was mostly different for every region that movie was shown in. For example, in North America, it had things like I Love Lucy and Steve Jobs. In the UK, it had Sherlock and the Beatles. In France, you had Daft Punk and The Fifth Element. In fact, the only standards that appeared in every country were the last 5 items on his list. Thai food, Star Wars/Star Trek, Nirvana, Rocky, and the Troubleman soundtrack. And finally, back to the DCEU for our last bonus fact. While you may think that poor DC hasn't had any success, well, think again. Several of their movies have grossed over $1 billion, with the Dark Knight movies and Joker being some of the biggest. But the number one grossing DCEU movie might actually shock you. Aquaman leads the list for DC with a whopping $1.148 billion made, outpacing The Dark Knight Rises by over $100 million. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why. Oh, yeah, that's fair.